Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jen and I'm your friendly neighborhood metalsmith. Today we are going to be talking about something that a lot of beginner metalsmiths struggle with. Soldering. Soldering was definitely a struggle for me in the beginning, and it still kind of is at times, but I have learned a ton in the last year and a half that I've been metalsmithing, so I am going to share my top 5 tips for beginner metalsmiths. In the beginning, when I first started soldering, I had watched a ton of YouTube videos and I thought it looked so much easier than it actually was, and I am entirely self-taught. And in all honesty, it took quite a few tries to get it right, but in the end, I'm pretty happy with where I'm at with my soldering and what I can do with it, and it's been a huge improvement. So here's just a couple of things that have helped me. So first thing we're going to talk about is actually safety, which is not usually a topic that comes up when it comes to soldering, but something that I noticed and I think gave me a slight problem at times was I was getting a lot of headaches. So when I first started soldering, I did get a respirator and I was wearing it all the time. And then I got a little overconfident, and when I was doing just like, those little tiny quick solder jobs, I decided I can just leave my dust mask on instead and just wear that. Yeah, very quickly I started getting really bad headaches. I'm assuming that was probably because of the solder fumes. So pretty soon after that, I think it took me a week or so to realize that it's probably from the solder fumes. I ended up picking up a fume extractor with a charcoal filter in it, and I have been using that every single time I solder. I also make sure that I am wearing my respirator, so no more headaches. I have definitely noticed that I don't get headaches, and I usually leave the respirator on for like a minute or two until all the fumes have disappeared and been taken out by my extractor, and I've had no issues. So definitely something to keep in mind when you're a beginner. Wear that respirator, especially if you're going to do this long term or you're going to be doing this a lot. Now, the next topic is cleanliness. So this is something that I haven't seen discussed as much in the beginner videos. It's mentioned sometimes, but not anywhere near as much as I thought it would be. And that is how clean your metal is when you're soldering. Now, I didn't really think this was that important. The first couple solder jobs that I did, I had no issues. I could solder something and then it was, slightly dirty from soldering. It was after I had quenched it. I go to solder my next piece and it still works just fine. So I didn't think I had any issues. Now, when I started getting into the more complex pieces, suddenly my solder was either not flowing or the pieces weren't really contacting very well and they weren't staying together. I could solder something on, especially I would sweat solder something, and then it would lift away for some reason. And I very quickly discovered that the source of my problems was that my metal was not clean. So when things weren't getting soldered down very well, and this was very apparent in my sweat soldered projects. So my first lesson when it came to getting better at soldering was making sure I have clean metal, and that meant I was pickling everything. So every time in between a step of solder, I would make sure I pickled it. And this drastically improved my work. I could actually sweat solder things so much easier, and it definitely helped my skill level grow a lot more rapidly. Making sure that everything went into the pickle pot in between made sure that I always had a clean metal to solder onto, and then that would remove a lot of that like fire scale and the bubbling from the flux, because I did use too much flux for quite a while. I still do, I think. I still probably use a lot more than I should. And that leaves this bubbly residue on it. Yeah, that doesn't help you solder. It's not a clean piece of metal. So pickle it in between every step. You'll thank me later for it because it will make things a lot easier. Now, the next tip is going to be your joint preparation. Whenever you're going to solder something, you always want to make sure your joints line up and they're flush and they're tight. That is all the advice that you hear in all the beginner videos. And I listened to that advice. So when I was making, say, ring shanks, for example, I would cut the wire, and obviously when you cut it, it leaves a little point, so then I would sit there and file it with my file. And the first, couple rings I made, first couple, 2-3 things, were great, were fantastic. I very quickly learned a lesson in patience because I did not have the patience to keep filing everything as well as I should have, and some of my joints, when I was trying to, say, make either rings or a piece for a necklace or anything, they were not perfectly smooth. So when I was trying to solder them, it wasn't connecting the way it should. It wasn't contacting together, and solder does not really fill gaps ever. It's very difficult for it to do that. So then your solder doesn't flow right, or it's only partially soldered, and that could lead to quality issues down the road. Especially if you sell something like that, it could break a lot easier. So this is where I started struggling with adding more elements to my pieces because I was trying to add them more quickly, and I was not taking the time to file them properly for soldering. So I learned my lesson to make sure that everything is filed evenly and I learned to actually really slow down my work. Silversmithing is an art form. Metalsmithing is a very delicate art form that does take a lot of time and a lot of patience, and it's not something that you can do quickly and produce good quality work. So I ended up finally slowing down and really focusing on the quality of the piece and the quality of the work rather than quantity. I realized I could not produce 10, 20 piece collections, and that in fact I'd have to really scale it back, maybe do only 5 piece collections that are really high quality, that are well made, and they won't break, and they will be durable and last somebody for a lifetime. And this lesson actually led to me investing in a miter jig. Now, I just bought a very, very low cost one from Amazon. I think it was maybe around $40 some, maybe 50, I don't remember. But it was not very expensive, and that has helped immensely. While it is a cheap one and it sometimes, struggles to close, you have to oil it, it works very, very well. It helps me get those nice clean edges for my joints, and I'm actually quite happy with it. So that is something that has really improved the quality of my work too. Now, the next step we're going to talk about is something that's mentioned a lot, but at the same time, sometimes you kind of forget. We're going to talk about how when you're working on a complex project, you got to do levels of solder. So this is something that took me a little while to learn because I just didn't encounter it at first in the beginning, and by then I had kind of forgotten it. So originally when I bought all my silver stuff, I bought the hard, medium, easy, and extra easy solder. I had all 4 levels of it. But when I first started, I was making just very simple pieces, so I was soldering in 1 or 2 steps, and I just kept using the medium solder for some reason. I just kept using it. Now, when I had a more complex piece I was trying to do, and for some reason, I don't remember why, I just kept sticking to the medium solder. I had completely forgotten that there was multiple levels of solder, because I just had that medium solder with an easy reach, and the other ones were put away. Out of sight, out of mind, I guess. But what happened is that I was using medium solder, and I would solder one element onto the piece, quench it, go to solder another one, quench it, go to solder the third one, and then the first element moved. And I realized that since I was using the same level of solder, every time I went to go use another medium solder, I was remelting the previous solder joints, which led to, more than one failed experiment. After 1 or 2 failures, I decided to go back and look at my solder and all the metals I had, and then I realized I have multiple levels, and I have kind of forgotten a key piece that, especially when you're a beginner, you've been watching a lot of tutorial videos and you're teaching yourself, sometimes you forget little things, and that was one thing that I had forgotten. So once you get past the simple pieces, don't forget that when you are soldering, you want to make sure that you're working in levels. You want to work from hard to extra easy. So now I just always make sure I start with the hard solder for everything, and then I work my way down. So for example, if I'm making a ring, I'm going to use the hard solder to solder the ring band, ring shank together, and then also use the hard solder for, say, the bezel wire, where I'm soldering the wire that's going to go around my stone together. Now that's 2 individual pieces of metal right there, and that is going to be my first step. My second step is going to be using the medium solder, and that is going to be soldering the bezel to the back plate. So I'll use the medium solder so I don't melt the hard solder from the bezel wire. So if you don't know that, hard, medium, easy, and extra easy solder all melts at different temperature. Hard solder melts at the highest temperature, so it requires less heat for your solder to flow, and you won't accidentally risk ruining your previous solder joints. And then I would continue on, and I would solder the bezel cup that I had made to the ring shank using easy solder. So just a very simple explanation of how you can use solder steps. Now when you get into very complex pieces, such as large sweat solder jobs, that gets a little bit tougher. So what I try to do is the biggest elements I'll make with the hard solder, try to get all of those on, and then I'll try to do several elements with medium solder. So I'm soldering several things at once, maybe sometimes 2 layers at once. And as long as everything is heated up properly, it tends to work very well. Because obviously if you're heating tons of things constantly, you're gonna find that you don't have enough levels of solder, especially for complex pieces. Part of my design process now is that when I am soldering, I make sure that I also incorporate the levels of solder into the piece. So I know that when I'm soldering this part, I'm going to use hard solder. When I'm doing this part, I'm going to do medium. Just something that I think about in the design process, so it makes my life a lot easier, because if I can't figure out how to actually put it together when I need to put it together, the design doesn't work very well. And that's happened more than once. So that is why I do that now. Now, my last tip for beginners is going to be about flame and heat distribution. So learning how heat and solder interact and flow is something that is discussed probably in almost every single beginner YouTube video. I taught myself this concept from watching YouTube videos, but thinking you understand the concept and actually understanding it is two vastly different things. So here's what I learned. You will hear things like make sure you heat your metal evenly and that the solder will flow towards the hottest part. Now this means that if you are heating up your metal, you're going to want to constantly keep your torch moving. That's part of what they mean by the evenly. My technique for heating up a piece evenly is to constantly keep moving my torch in a circle, and at first I start in very fast circles so the flame doesn't linger or on any one part of the metal, because if you let it linger, you're going to find that you can very easily melt a piece of silver. So I don't let the flame linger, and what I do is I will heat something up and I will go in circles and gradually kind of close in onto the center, like inward on the piece or onto whatever point that I want to solder. And I'll let those circles get slower. As my torch speed decreases and I start moving them in slower circles, that's going to heat up the metal a little bit faster in those certain spots, and that'll get a little hotter and hotter. So this is the best way that I found to heat up the metal evenly. I know a lot of people tell you to heat it up evenly, but not everybody explains what that means. And that is really just making sure that the piece heats up slowly so you don't melt anything, and the entire piece heats up. So you want to keep making sure that your flame is going over everything, because whatever is not hot acts as a heat sink. So when you're trying to get your solder to flow, that heat is dissipating and it's not staying there. So when you're heating up a ring band, this concept is the easiest to understand. Basically, as you start heating it up, I move the torch around it in pretty fast circles so that not one part of the metal gets super hot, and then I gradually slow it down. And as you slow it down, you'll see the ring band sometimes turn almost like a reddish orangey color if it gets really hot, and you'll see after a couple really slow passes, your solder flows. And that means that your metal was hotter so that your solder flowed towards it. So when you're soldering something a little bit more complex, like a ring with a bezel cup, you have to heat up the entire piece. So you're still making that circular motion, but since the bezel cup might be, say, larger sometimes than the ring band, you might be spending a little bit more time in slowing down towards that bezel cup and then still moving slowly across the ring band, but not quite as slow because it's less metal to heat and you still don't want to melt it. So you have to kind of account for the size differences of the pieces of metal that you're heating. So when I first started learning to metalsmith, I thought I understood the concept, but I didn't quite get it, because in my earlier learning to metalsmith videos, especially when I was practicing with copper, you can kind of see where, like, I'm trying to heat the piece up evenly, I'm running my torch over the entire thing, but then rather than just continuously moving my torch, I start to focus in on the solder, and the solder turns into a little ball, and then it refuses to melt. And it's just staying there as a little ball as I have my torch on it. And because it was copper, the copper really doesn't melt that easily unless you have a super intense heat. So for a butane torch, it wasn't melting, but the solder wasn't melting either. And this is kind of where I learned how solder and heat and flame really work together, because eventually I learned that you are not melting the solder. What you're doing is heating up the metal so the metal can melt the solder and flow and create your joint. So in a nutshell, what you're really doing is allowing the metal to flow to solder and not your torch. So just a different way of thinking about it, but once I learned that instantly made the concept of soldering so much easier to understand and be able to practice. And now when I look at a piece and how I'm going to make that solder flow, I can visualize how I need to move my torch, what parts I need to heat, and how I need to move it to get that to flow, which that was probably one of the biggest struggles, especially when I was trying to very quickly jump into making complex pieces and sweat solder, which is a totally different skill in itself than just soldering a joint together like a ring shank or anything. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope these tips help you. If you have any other tips for beginner metalsmiths, please feel free to drop them down in the comment section below. I love that on some of my previous videos on electroforming and metalsmithing, my comment section has blown up and been a very nice conversation of all different kinds of tips and tricks and suggestions. And I can see that a lot of people have been benefiting from that, not just me, but I have also found a lot of those tips very useful and have been using some of them. So thank you for starting the conversation, and honestly, let's keep it going. So if you have any tips, definitely drop them down below. I definitely appreciate that, and I have definitely learned a lot of things myself from you guys. Don't forget to hit that like button, click the subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next video.